Hello, my name is Gurpreet Dhillon and I'm a professor of information security at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia. The topic of our discussion today is ethics and information security policy implementation. In any kind of a security policy implementation, ethical considerations cannot be downplayed. They play a very important role in understanding the multiple stakeholder perspectives that come into play when any kind of a policy has to be implemented. This is because policy implementation does not necessarily take place in a vacuum. There are legal considerations, there are other stakeholders within an institution that need to be thought about. One also has to consider how a given policy impacts other institutions or other constituents within an organization. All these things come together and give us a rather complex interplay between the artifact that we have created, which takes the form of a policy, technical as it might be, but it has to reside within the business processes and has to be adopted and used by the people. And because of that, if we just simply implement it and it changes the way in which people work, changes the way in which people are interacting with each other, then the policy in its own right is not a good policy or it has not been implemented very well. In our daily lives, we see several such instances where we see policies which do not necessarily are in sync with each other. Only earlier in the day today, I was talking with a colleague, and in their school, they had a policy where they had collaborative learning classrooms. But those collaborative learning classrooms required, the facilities management people required a notice of about 30 minutes to set it up, which is fair enough, understandable. They have to come and they have to reconfigure the classrooms. But the way the scheduling was done for different lectures and classes, the time between any two classes was just about 15 minutes. So in net effect, you could really not use any of the classrooms for any kind of collaborative work. A perfect example of two policies not being in sync with each other. Now, is this an ethical consideration? Yes, to some extent, yes. But is it bad policy? Yeah, probably it's bad policy overall. But if you look at one policy and the other, they are probably pretty good in their own right. So I think when we are implementing any kind of a policy, one has to consider how it is related with other policies, how it syncs in with the organizational purpose for which a policy is being created in the first instance, and look into the overall integrity of the enterprise. If in net effect we are compromising the integrity of the enterprise, then perhaps we are not doing a good job as far as any kind of a policy implementation. This becomes very, very important in the context of cybersecurity, particularly security policy implementation. Let me give you another example. Think in terms of a password security policy being implemented. Now, if the password policy is such where it kind of changes how people are getting authorized and how certain responsibilities are being allocated, then it changes something else. Although technically we are just implementing a good password policy, but the impact it has on the organization structures, the impact it has on how people are reporting to each other has a bearing on the security policy. So two things cannot be divorced from each other. They have to be built upon each other. They have to ensure the integrity between two policies. One may be a personnel policy, the other one is a security password policy. So any policy has to be think in terms of a collective, not as independent parts. These two parts have to come together and work for each other's benefit. So those are the kind of things, and what are the stakeholder perspectives that need to be addressed are some of the things that I will be discussing in this. The context within which an institution operates, a company operates, is obviously bounded by a range of legal requirements. So when we implement a security policy, the first instance, we have to understand the environment in which we are operating, environment in which a company is operating, and understand all the legal requirements that there might be. For instance, I have identified 7 such legal requirements in the context of the US, which any enterprise needs to understand. These are regulations that have been created particularly with respect to cybersecurity, particularly with respect to fraud and computer crime, that we need to be cognizant of. If you look into the first one, which is 1029, it describes the prohibitions and penalties that are associated with unauthorized possession and fraudulent use of access tokens, passwords, and other devices. Now, this particular requirement turns on how a certain policy is going to be formulated, particularly with respect to how passwords are used, shared, and how they enable us to access various devices. 1030, for example, describes prohibitions and penalties for the unauthorized access of and fraudulent use of electronic systems, whatever kind of electronic system it might be. It may be a computer, it might be a handheld, it might be some kind of an Internet of Things device, or so on and so forth. So the access, how it one device accesses another device and how it connects back into the internet has an impact on the policy that we might create. IoT security policy, if we have one in place, has to be cognizant again of the legal requirements that there might be with respect to communication between various devices. 1362, for example, talks about communication lines, stations, and systems. And this particular requirement describes prohibitions of malicious or willful destruction of internet to disrupt any kind of a communication within the US. So if someone is intentionally trying to disrupt communication over the internet, that is actually punishable under the code of law. So our policy should be cognizant of this, because any kind of an activity which is going to disrupt this communication may actually not be Similarly, 2511, 2701, 2702, 2703 again touch upon various other requirements. 2511 talks about interception and disclosure of wire, oral, and electronic communications and the prohibitions therein. So any kind of a loss of data while it is being transferred from one particular device to another, may it be cellular or wire based, has to be in line with this particular requirement. 2701 talks about unlawful access to stored communication. So if we are actually storing any kind of a communication, the archives of emails for that matter, they have a certain kind of a policy that has to be thought in terms of disclosure of content. We cannot, and particularly if we go into the healthcare sector, this becomes a huge deal. Even in electronic medical records, or in the case of a university environment where we are protecting the data from student data from being distributed to other people, that becomes a very important issue. How government access is being managed, that becomes a very important thing. This it's essentially 2703 describes the requirements for electronic communication services and remote computing services, and how they disclose data to government entities and information regarding subscribers or customers. Now, this came under light very recently when the intelligence agencies wanted access to iPhone data, particularly after the San Bernardino attacks earlier in 2016, and Apple refusing to give the encryption code publicly. Now, there is obviously a political battle going on here and a corporate battle about whether such encryption codes should be made public and shared with the state or not. It turns on a number of very interesting dialogues. This kind of a debate also came into light earlier on in the mid-90s when Phil Zimmermann came up with his pretty good privacy PGP software, which would encrypt data to such an extent that it would be practically impossible for the intelligence agencies to break into the code And they were actually asking Phil Zimmermann to release or come up with a lower level of encryption for his communication software, which he refused. I remember a time when he was actually thinking of relinquishing his US citizenship because he did not want to budge from his position. He was arguing that there are many rebel groups who use pretty good privacy in order to communicate with each other. Hence, there was a need for a higher level of encryption. Now, that was certainly a tool, a software that was created which was in violation with the legal requirements of a given country, in this particular case, the United States. There might be other such cases where an enterprise comes up with all sorts of policies which may not necessarily align very well with the national level requirements or the state level requirements. So whenever we are building these policies, one needs to be thinking about how they link back into into different levels of an enterprise to a country. And in this particular case, if you're talking about in the internet and telecommunications, what does the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, how do they view policy, and how should we be responsive to their requirements? And the list goes on and on. But I think the message here is that one needs to understand various kinds of stakeholders and requirements when implementing these policies. Now, what we have been discussing all along is the need for good, well-designed policies which should incorporate all sorts of very sophisticated algorithms. But fact of the matter is, when these have to be implemented, one needs to understand the various stakeholder perspectives. One also needs to understand why certain policies do not get implemented as a consequence. Now, the resistance that we always talk about, that there's going to be some kind of a resistance to a security policy, legal requirements are certainly one aspect which bring in that resistance, but it could be the lack of integrity of a given rule structure that we have created, which does not necessarily link in with the national level structures that might exist or the corporate level structures that might exist. So, in a nutshell, any kind of an understanding of where the given security policy feeds in at a higher level is very important to understand, and how it impacts the bottom rungs of the organization. That's also very important to understand. So an appreciation for going up and down in terms of the levels of an organization and the impact a policy might have is absolutely critical. It is relatively easy to create a policy, but rather more difficult to implement it, and even more difficult for it to sustain itself. And it becomes even further challenging to ensure that the policy does not harm any individual or any group within an organization. There are 6 aspects which I like thinking about in terms of security policy implementation and the ethics that go with it. The first and foremost is that of employment. When I say employment, how does a given policy impact the way in which people work? Are we letting go of certain people because of a certain implementation? What impact does it have on the lives of people, working lives of people? That is an important consideration from an ethical perspective. Second aspect that needs to be thought about is that of privacy. How does a given policy impact an individual's privacy in a given enterprise or in the society as such? How does the privacy of a group or a unit within an institution gets affected? This is an important consideration because it leads to a range of issues related with individuality, individual identity, and how people define themselves within a given enterprise. Thirdly, we also look into the crime elements. In this particular case, what I really mean is, does a given policy disrupt the business processes such that we are creating opportunities for criminal acts to take shape? So one has to be very careful, particularly with respect to business process design and redesign when we are implementing new policies such that we are not creating an opportunity for a crime to occur. Fourthly, it's the working conditions of the people. If any policy implementation changes the working conditions to such an extent that it is people are feeling unhappy or distraught or are unable to accomplish what they wanted to or more stressful, then we have significantly impacted the working conditions. This is an important aspect because any policy has to be implemented properly, and that also raises a very interesting issue about security and usability. It's not just the usability of the systems, it's the usability of the policies and how they have been implemented. Everybody is perhaps on board that they need to be more secure. But in the process, if we compromise the usability aspects of a system of doing your own work the way you wanted to do, then you are perhaps compromising some ethical aspects by changing the working conditions. Fifthly, we talk about individuality. If I have to redefine myself as a consequence of security policy implementation, that means my individuality is being questioned, which means what my relationship is with me and what is my relationship with the organization, with the society at large. If that gets redefined, that is certainly impacting my individuality. Now, whenever we bring in any kind of a change, any kind of a new implementation, certainly things are going to change. What we are not concerned about is the change per se, but change that impacts us negatively. Change that kind of affects us in doing our work on a regular basis. And finally, it's the health. So in a bigger scheme of things, if I'm creating a more stressful environment because of implementation of certain policies, that means I'm actually questioning how healthy my workforce is going to be. I don't want to create a workforce which is unhealthy and hence create disgruntled employees, which in itself is a security threat of sorts. So it's important to consider various aspects, ethical aspects whenever we are implementing. I have identified 6 such aspects which I call ethical implementation principles, which need to be thought about whenever we are implementing any security policy. And these in totality will ensure that negative consequences of any implementation are minimized and we are able to implement security policies in a healthy, in a proactive, in a positive environment.